Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to screen share, attempt to. Let's hope it doesn't all go wrong again this time. Just to do a very quick recap on what we achieved last year. So in 2020, we had 6 volunteers who went out and surveyed 1 kilometre grid squares in 13 different locations. It was done between the end of May and the beginning of August. We have 74 individual Monticular recordings, and I just added a little bit more info in there. The average temperature was about 17 degrees centigrade, so that sort of marks what was a really lovely spring. About half the records were before noon, half after, and 64% of the days were really sunny. So it was really, really good bumblebee weather. So let's hope it's as good this year. So our achievements from last year is that we managed to produce a baseline distribution map for Bombus monticular that covered much of the dry heath on the Long Mynd, although not all of it. And we've also produced evidence that monticular is foraging in Ginline Meadow, and we had 1 record from Allstretton. And I think for me, the biggest thing that also came out of last year is that we now have a species recovery plan written by the National Trust. So very exciting. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, Debbie. And if anyone wasn't on the call last week and wants to know a lot more about what we found from last year's survey, you can watch that recording back on YouTube. Okay, so I think, are we ready to move on to Richard? Was that all you wanted to say, Debbie? Yep, great. So I'm really happy that, again, we're joined by Richard Comont from Bumblebee Conservation Trust. And he's going to just give us a bit of background really on carder bees, which are the focus of this extended survey, this level 2 survey. So over to you, Richard.
Okay, just that should be coming through. Yeah, there we go. So let's click on the right bit, will help. So there are actually 3 species of what we call the ginger carders. They are the ones that stand out. Basically, there are a couple of other carder bees, but they aren't found in that area, so we're not going to talk about them. The standard common carder is the one that's everywhere. It's ginger all over, got a bit of black in the back end, and it's a common and widespread species. As I say, it's closely related to 2 rare species, which makes the ID difficult where you have all 3. Generally, as you can see, this is the map of the records in and around the particular project area. This is going to make up the vast majority of the ginger bumblebee sightings that you see. There is also the moss carder. Historically, this has been fairly widespread in Britain, as you can see from here. In practice, what we're finding is that these northern populations are holding up. So in Scotland, it seems to be doing really quite well. If you go up to the Orkneys and the Hebrides in particular, it's one of the commonest bumblebee species. But these populations in the south are gradually hollowing out. So it's gradually edging out to the coasts. But even there, those populations don't seem to be doing particularly well. So it's quite nice to have it in this area, and it's worth keeping an eye on because it is a population which is likely to be struggling at the moment. You can see it is still around in there. There are a couple of records. It likes slightly damper areas generally, but it is around. What is a fairly new ginger carder species around is the brown-banded carder, Bombus humilis. This has always had a very southern distribution, as you can see. Most of these northern records were lost over the last century, but over the last 10 or 20 years, it's actually been pushing northwards again. And so it made it into Worcestershire, Hartlebury Common sort of area in about 2009, 2010 sort of time, and has since spread further north from there. It is around in the project area. Again, there are a couple of records of it around Bishop's Castle sort of area. It's almost certainly going to be a species which is seen more frequently in that area. And certainly as people start to look for it and start to be able to remember that the ginger bumblebee that they see is possibly not just a common carder, then this is a species which is likely to have more records in the future. So in terms of splitting them, things are not the most straightforward. So this is your standard common carder. You can see it's everywhere, and it's this ginger pretty much all over it. It varies slightly in colour from a dull brown sort of colour, which is particularly workers, right up to really quite vibrant, bright orange ginger sort of colour. But it's always got some black hairs on the abdomen. And as you can see here, looking across it, you can see that these hairs are black as opposed to these ginger ones here. Males, workers and queens all look pretty much the same. Males tend to be a little bit more yellow. Workers tend to be a little bit more brown, but they overlap a huge amount. It's a continuum of colour, all within this same basic colour scheme. The moss carder is brighter. Both the rare carders are much brighter generally than the common carder. They are noticeably ginger and yellow as opposed to being brown. So you can see here it's got this bright sort of chestnut orangey ginger thorax with the yellow, almost sort of butter yellow hair around the sides and the back. And then again, the abdomen is this bright sort of butter yellow. It's a much warmer coloration. In the field, I find the easiest thing is that it's got these yellow sides to the thorax. They really do show up as quite obvious flashes and very different to the dull beige of the common carder you can see here. The brown-banded carder is very similar to the moss carder. Again, it's got the same sort of distinctive ID features that tell it not a common carder. So it's got this orangey ginger top to the thorax. It's got this yellow abdomen. It does have this band across here, this band across the second abdominal stergite. That's not hugely distinctive because Muscorum moss carder also has a band there, which is generally ginger rather than specifically brown. And it's also where the common carder has a lot of black hairs, unfortunately. But it does stand out in the field, and that combined with the yellow sides to the thorax, again, you can see them here, should just make you look twice. There's a possibility that this is something more interesting than just the common carder. But it can be quite tricky when you get all three species side by side. Even when you've got one of each, it's not hugely straightforward. So in practice, that is actually Muscorum. That one is Pascorum, the common carder, and this one in the middle is Humilis, the brown-banded carder. So you have to look quite closely to be able to identify them. This is something that you will need to catch it and put it in a pot and have a close look. This is not something that generally you're going to be able to do as it flies by. Pascorum, common carder, always has some black hairs on the abdomen. Looking down on it from this sort of angle is very difficult because the actual bee itself, the exoskeleton, is black underneath, but you can see that some of these hairs here are black. This is a particularly pale individual. Often they look like that, which is very, very straightforward because you can see this massive, great wodge of black hairs here. It can't be anything else when it looks like that. But just bear in mind that they do go quite pale as well. But if it's got any black hairs on the abdomen at all, it's a common carder, and the vast majority of the ginger bees that you see will have some black hairs. They will be the common carder. It does live up to its name. The brown-banded carder, which I would suspect is going to be the second most recorded ginger carder. As I say, it's an increasing species at the moment. It doesn't have any black hairs on the abdomen. So the best way is to look across. That way you're not looking down onto the black of the bee, you're just looking at the colour of the hairs. You can see this rim here across the top of the bee are those which you aren't looking down onto the black of the exoskeleton. You can see the actual colour of those hairs far better than you can in here. So just ginger and yellow hairs on the abdomen, no black. But what it does have is this thin scatter of black hairs around the wing bases on the thorax. So it's got these yellow sides and ginger top to the thorax, and scattered in here, you can see these black hairs. This is a hand lens job. This is not something that you're going to see even with the naked eye, even with it in a pot. So it is something that you will need to look for. This is not something that's going to stand out in the field. You can do it from photos if you have decent photos. Obviously you can see them in this, but this is quite a nice picture with it relatively sharp and where you're able to blow it up to the size of the screen. So it is a difficult group to identify from photos unless we've actually got them of the right areas. Muscorum, the moss carder, the third species, as I said before, it tends to live down in the slightly wetter areas. Humilis likes it hot, Muscorum likes it cold and wet, which is why it does so well in Scotland. This is a species which, again, just ginger or yellow hairs on the abdomen. If you zoom in, you can see there's no black hairs at all. On the thorax, there's also no black hairs. So where Humilis had that scattering of little black hairs around the wing bases here, you can see this one doesn't. It's just got yellow and ginger hairs around here. But again, you can see you really need to be able to zoom into this sort of level to be able to see it definitively. You can still see the yellow on the sides. You can still see this bright ginger on the top. It's clearly different, but to the common carder, but splitting it between those two slightly rarer ginger carders is quite tricky. So I also put a little section in about what might be useful kit. Anything sold as a butterfly net is going to be fine for catching bumblebees. Don't use shrimping nets because the holes tend to be too big, but anything designed for catching insects in midair will be fine. Watkins and Doncaster do an awful lot of them, but you can get them all over the place. For looking for those sort of black hairs on the thorax and on the abdomen, a hand lens is really, really useful. You only need 10 times really for that. That's a nice combination of depth of field and having enough magnification to be able to see what you actually need to see. If you go above that, even up to 20 times or so, the depth of field gets so small that it's very difficult to actually keep the right bit in focus for long enough to recognize what it is, because the bee is moving around. And these queen marking cages are really, really useful for that, because this is just a bit of mesh across the bottom of a perspex tube. This is a wooden plunger with a bit of sponge on the end. Your bee goes in here and you can just gently constrain it against that grid at the end. You don't ram it down because then you end up with bee spaghetti, but you can just gently push it against the end, and that way it's not vibrating all over the place. You're not trying to focus on something which is moving constantly, but instead it's just sat there and you can hold it still for long enough to be able to look at the relevant hairs and the different bits of the body and have a chance of actually seeing them in focus. And there are a whole range of ID books if you want to go down that route instead of just sending pictures to Charlie. These three will certainly help you identify the ginger carders particularly. The Bumblebee Conservation Trust book, which I clicked on by mistake there, is designed to help you get to that sort of level of detail in the field. The Priest Jones book takes a key approach, so you need to take specimens back a little bit more, and so does Steve's field guide to a certain extent. This is a good book in general, but probably won't help you with the ginger carders particularly, and this is much more natural history rather than ID, but they will all help you get a little bit closer to working out which one you've got, but particularly these three down the middle here. And that was everything from me, I think.
Great, thanks, Richard. Has anyone got any questions? As I said, I'm happy for people just to unmute and chip in with questions for Richard. Is it okay to share these slides, Richard? With
yeah,
people?
I can send you them.
Great, thank you. I have a question about how it's best to hold a bumblebee. So you had some pictures there where you were holding the wings. Is that sort of recommended technique, or would you advise against that?
I wouldn't recommend it for beginners, certainly. These are pictures that came from Steve Fulks Flecker, who's obviously very experienced at picking up bees whilst not being stung. But having spoken to him about it, he also doesn't mind being stung too much. It does still happen when you're picking them up like this. So I would suggest that this queen marking tube is by far the best way to actually pick them up, because then you're not handling it directly. Obviously, you don't want to suddenly find out that you're anaphylactic on a moor in the middle of nowhere having just been stung. So a net and one of these queen marking pots, you don't actually touch the bee at all that way. So it minimises the risk of anything around that. It minimises the risk of doing anything to the bee, and it also minimises the amount of time that you need to have the bee in captivity compared to putting it in a normal pot or anything like that. So it's just quickest and safest for everything involved.
Okay, thanks. And Debbie has actually bought some of these queen marker cages, and I think willing that everyone on this call has one. Is that right, Debbie?
Yep, Charlie, yeah, that's fine. I'll bring them up to Carding Mill. There's 15, so there's more than enough to go around at the moment. But hopefully if more people join the project, then yeah, just encourage them to come and get one.
Great, yeah, so if anyone wants to just drop me an email and we'll arrange a time for you to come to Carding Mill Valley and collect your queen marker cage. We've also got a sweep net, well, a couple of sweep nets available from the National Trust office as well, if anyone wants to borrow one of those for a couple of days and have a go if you don't have one yourself. Again, just drop me an email and we can arrange that. Richard, could you just quickly talk about the best way to catch a bee in case anyone's not used to using a sweep net?
Yeah, so it's tricky to do it without demonstrating, but the best way is to walk the net as close to the bee as you possibly can, so that it has the least possible time to react to it, and then flick the wrist as if you're doing that sort of tennis shot, so that you whoosh past the bee is in the bottom, and then flick it over, so that the net, instead of just dangling down underneath your net frame, then flicks around and sits on top of it at the end of your strike. So it's almost that sort of reverse and semicircle, and that way the bee remains caught in the net rather than just being able to fly straight out as you pick it up. And that way, as it walks through, again, you can just pick it out in the pot far more easily. But I do actually have a net here randomly, so it is just sweeping by and then flicking up at the end, so it ends up like that. So the bee is in the end here somewhere, which is sat on top of the net frame. It can't just fly out, it has to walk, and you can see where it is. You can collar it in the end of the net there and pick it out with your pot that way. So I tend to just hold the actual net bag like that, so it doesn't catch on any brambles or anything. Just let that go as you strike and then flick it over. It's almost a sort of figure of 6 movement with your arm.
So you can do anything via Zoom. Any more questions for Richard?
Could I ask, I think, Richard, you said something about getting darker. Is there a tendency for them to be brighter and lighter coloured early on, and then darkening with age?
Generally, the individuals don't change a huge amount. There's a little bit of sun bleaching, but not noticeable for these 3. What you do tend to get is that the queens are bright ginger, brighter than the workers. So you tend to, at this time of year, when they're all starting to come out of hibernation, you see really bright individuals about. The workers tend to be a little bit more dull, possibly because they're spending all of their time out and about and get a little bit faded, a little bit abraded. And then the males later in the season, all of these will have males from August onwards generally. They're quite late species. And the males, again, can be quite bright and quite yellow tinged compared to the females.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, so if we hand back to Debbie now, Debbie's going to talk about the survey this year and what we're going to ask you to do in terms of the carder bees and the Bombus monticola, the bilberry bumblebee.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. I've got to put a bit more light on. The sun's gone down, hasn't it? Okay, right, let's go back to screen sharing. So far, so good. Oh no, screen share, screen share. Okay, so Richard's covered quite a lot of what I've put on the slides, so I can bomb through this quite quickly. Those are the 3 carder bees with their full Latin names. Richard's got more records than I have. I found a couple on iRecord. So one was for Humilis, was found in 2019 at Crossways, which is Church Stretton. And just to be fair on the Stepping Stones project, the other was found on the Stiper Stones in 2016, which was a moss carder bee. So we've covered the project area, Charlie, which is a good thing. I wanted to reiterate, actually, having gone out yesterday to look at the carder bees, that black chitin on the exoskeleton is quite prominent. So if you're looking for the presence or absence of black hairs, it's something you do need to really consider. And that's, as Richard said, the sideways view is the best way of seeing whether they're black or not. So just bear that in mind. The aims of the project this year, and I'm trying not to be over ambitious here, obviously we want to increase our records of the carder bees and not to forget monticular, because it would be really great if we could spread the area over which we have sightings. It would be really good if one of the outcomes from this would be to define some areas where we could start conducting bee walks. If you don't know about those, Richard, maybe you give them a plug later, because that in the end is what gives us a lot of data and an overall UK-wide understanding of how the bumblebees are doing. So it'd be really great if some of us could start signing up to do that next year. And the third one is hopefully, with willingness of the National Trust and COVID restrictions, we might be able to have a couple of meetings at Ginline Meadow. I think it would be really helpful if we could really go in there and do a thorough survey. Pascuorum, I think I'm right in saying, Richard, means of the meadow, so it is particularly a meadow bee, so it'll be a great place to go and see the carder bees. So hopefully we can add that into the project as we go along. Okay, so the method, really, I'm not trying to make it too difficult. It's very similar to the red tail method I've put together. You ideally need to walk in the Stepping Stones project area. If you're not sure where that is, I'm sure Charlie will be sending a map out later. And to stop near flowers, so obviously we have quite a lot of dry heath records, so we'd be looking at dry heath where we currently have no records, and there's a map for that which you can refer to if you fancy going somewhere where there are bilberries and heather. Also the wet flushes which run off the top of the Mind, the valleys, the Batches Hollow, etc., and obviously any meadows that you come across, but really anywhere in the project area where you know there's an abundance of flowers, it's going to be worth, you know, taking a lovely walk, enjoying the scenery, and don't forget your net so that you can check out which bees are there. As I said last time, it is quite important to listen, even if it seems to be a big open flowering shrub. I always find that listening to for the buzz of the bumblebee is always the first sign that I know that there's one present, and then I spend time looking until you can identify where it is. Okay, so collecting your evidence. Now, Richard, I am going to attempt, because you've done a wonderful demonstration, and now I'm going to attempt to show you how I do it, which isn't as wonderful and slick as yours. But am I on the full screen, Charlie? Right, so I do have a plant. When I go to catch the bees, I'm not as clever with the net as Richard is. So what I tend to do is locate the bee on the flower or the plant, hold the top of the net, and then if you put it over where the bee is foraging, when the bee takes off, it tends to take off upwards. So if you're not confident with doing the meadow sweep, that is another method. And then, as Richard said, once it's up higher in the net, you can actually isolate it, put a twist, and then while you're getting all your equipment ready, you've actually got a bee caught in the net there. I'll leave you to work out how to get the bee into the pot, and no animal was harmed in the showing of this. It's my grandson's little model bee. But once you've got it in there, it will move around quite a bit. If you squash it against the grid, what I was finding is some of the identification becomes a bit harder because you're actually looking at the blue squares of the grid. And the other thing that I found is actually then trying to hold a smartphone, a plunger, a moving bee, and hold it in the right direction for sunlight all became a little bit tricky. So little bit of Heath Robinson here, which is what every good beekeeper can do. They make something. So all that is the corner of a yogurt pot. The ideal thing being is it's white background. I've nailed it onto a piece of wood, and what it enables me to do is to put the bee against a white background and then make it hands-free. So I don't know if you've ever come across that before, Richard, but anyway, it may help you. Right, let's go back to screen sharing. First thing you need to do, if you can see it's a ginger bee or it has the very large red tail of monticular, net your bee as I've demonstrated, or maybe even better the way Richard has demonstrated. You need to place your pot over the bee and very carefully introduce the bun plunger. I usually trap the pot against the net and then find a way of getting the plunger up into it without the bee escaping. Something I wanted to throw in there is just be very aware at the moment we're mostly seeing queens foraging. Obviously the whole future of the nest depends on them. So if you are practicing, just be extra careful, because these queens, you know, are much more precious than, well, all bees are worth looking after, but obviously these queen bees are the ones that we're hoping will establish a nest. So be very careful at this time of year. So photography, Richard, you might want to come back in on this later. There's a really good field guide that you can take out with you, which we can provide, that was put together by Steve Falk. It's got a variety of photographs, it's got pointers of what you're looking for. Most of the photographs there are taken either from the side of the bee, going back to be able to see what colour the hairs are, or from above the bee. So if you can, what I found with my smartphone is I took about 10 pictures, and then once I'd let the bee go, I went back through them, got rid of all the ones out of focus where the bee's facing the wrong way, and just kept the best two for the records. Really important, I think, with this one, especially if you do find a rarity, we want them to go onto iRecord. So try and take your 6-figure Ordnance Survey reference number, please. Hopefully, if you're all recorders, you know how to use that. There's plenty of apps around that will give you that automatically, or you may be very clever and be able to do it directly off your Ordnance Survey map, which I do actually remember being taught how to do that in school, so I can sort of remember. And of course, you might be able to include which flower the bee was foraging on, which is all good information. And don't forget to release the bee, obviously, back where you were working, so that it's in the right area to return to its nest. Okay, no, just before I go on, I was just going to say, and again, Richard, maybe for you again, in terms of how likely you are to see these rare bees, a nest of the Pasciorum will have up to 200 workers. And the rarer bees will only have about 50 workers. So you've already got a significantly less lower chance of actually seeing one of these bees. Added in their rarity, you're going to have to look at quite a lot of ginger carder bees to see one of the rare ones. I took a figure of 1 in 50 chance. Maybe Richard can correct me on that. And obviously take into account the colour variation, which is why I've put on the next slide. This is what I got up to yesterday. And I caught 2 ginger bees. I think you can see from the picture, they're very different. Got very excited about the middle one. But I think it's a Pasciorum, is it not, Richard? Yeah. The reason I got excited is you can see, and even from the side, there's hardly any black hairs on that abdomen. But going to Steve Falk's key, and what made me change my mind after getting excited, is there isn't the halo of yellow around it. And also it was quite scruffy. I think those were the 2 things that sort of sent me back to, oh no, I've just got a different colour of the same bee. But hopefully you can see there on that picture how that white background and the hands-free setup sort of helped with getting a photograph. Much easier to zoom in later once you've got a good picture. Right, and this is the last one, Rich, and I hope you're going to give me a nod for this one. Okay, I had a record sent in today from a gentleman who is a moth expert. He's done a survey in my garden already last year, and he sent me in what he called some very bad photographs taken on his phone, but I'm going to show it to you now. Can you tell me what that is?
Looks like Monty to me.
It is Monticular, isn't it? I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
It's a horrible angle, but I would say so from that tail.
So I've asked him to take some more pictures. And I need to find out where he lives as well. But I mean, that's a really brilliant start to our work, you know, if we've already got one within a week. So that's a good start, isn't it? Okay, I will stop there. And Richard, if you can pick up on some of those things, that would be great.
Yeah, so just going back to your bees there, the key thing for me in the field that means I wouldn't look at them particularly closely is that you could see they had that very obvious orange abdomen. It wasn't yellow. So the halo certainly wasn't there as well. And had you got the side view, you'd have been able to see that that was clearly sort of off-white rather than yellow. But also that abdomen, although you couldn't necessarily see the black hairs very well from that sort of distance, you could see that it was very obviously ginger. It wasn't yellow, and that sort of difference. If I were going to suggest one thing for your interesting device, I would suggest painting it pale grey. White has a tendency to burn out anything because it's too much of a highlight. If you can paint it pale grey, then you get the same sort of bee standing out from its background without burning out the highlights quite as much, which is quite useful for some of the finer colour balance and that sort of thing. Otherwise, yeah, we covered the how to take a good photo last week. I've actually just sent that in the presentation to Charlie. Basically, side view gives us the best overall chance of getting the bee, but a side view, a front view and a tail view gives us the best overall chance because then you can see all of the ID features all at once. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted me to cover.
Any other questions for Debbie or Richard?
So presumably if we put a record on iRecord as a common card, it'll get looked at and you know someone will come back to us if we're wrong.
If it's got those photos, then
Yeah.
it will get checked, certainly. Common carder is the default ginger carder, so
yeah.
It won't get picked up quite as much as if you put a record on a Fumilis or Muscorum, which is somewhere unexpected.
What I will say is if you're doing things like that, and I would absolutely encourage people to use iRecord and other things like that, but if you could also, once you've had that record verified, if you could also just let me or Debbie know, because it's so useful for the project to be able to get the records kind of quickly and easily, but also just to be able to say how many records we've made and you know, the geographic spread of the records and everything like that. And it's just nice to have that directly from you instead of waiting until we can download that from iRecord and do various bits of analysis on there. So yeah, by all means use iRecord, but if you could also maybe once you've had that record confirmed, just drop that to me as well.
Actually, it would take a while to get confirmation, Charlie. It always does with Monticular.
Yeah,
so
okay.
Ideally, if you can send it to us at the same time, I think would be helpful.
Okay.
If that's possible. Yeah.
And in terms of submitting your results or your queries, again, if you send them to me, I'm happy to act as the first point of contact. I will admit that I am starting at a complete beginner with these carder bees, so I would love if you had a go at IDing them, because you're going to be probably more experienced than me. So I'll probably just act as an intermediary and maybe get the help of some other people if we need to question the ID or verify that for you. So yeah, just to kind of manage your expectations about my level of expertise with carder bees. I'll be asking for help. Any other questions about any of that? Okay, so I think that's everything we intended to cover tonight, really. We've whizzed through it. So just a reminder that if you do want one of those queen marker cages, or if you want to borrow a net, then drop me a line. I think I've got a few of those books that Richard mentioned as well, so I can always lend those out if that's something you want to have a look at, maybe before you decide whether or not you want to buy your own. And other than that, we'll send a follow-up email with Richard's slides and with a few other resources that Debbie's mentioned, and some links. And we'll also, as I mentioned, pop this video on YouTube so you can re-watch any of the bits about the ID if you need to refresh your memory. Okay,
All
so
of the ID stuff that I've gone through over the 2 weeks is part of videos on the BBCT YouTube channel as well.
okay, I'll share a link to those then. Okay, so unless there's anything else, just thank you again to Richard for giving up his evening, and to Debbie for just being the driving force behind this whole thing, and to everyone else for taking part. And I really hope we get some interesting records of some of the carder bees. Okay.
Thank you, Charlie.
All right, thanks everyone. Take care.
Good, thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks,
Thanks
Charlie.
Richard.
Cheers.
Bye.